The mission. The planet was cold, dark, and silent. It felt alive, as if the very ground was watching. Captain Rick Daniels tightened his grip on the rifle in his hands. Around him, his team moved cautiously, their boots crunching softly against the strange, glass-like surface of the ground. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if warning them to turn back. But turning back wasn't an option. Rick and his squad had one mission: eliminate the alien monsters hiding in this facility. The monsters had been described as vicious, deadly, and an immediate threat to humanity. Headquarters made it clear: no one was to leave this planet alive, not even the smallest creature. "Stay sharp," Rick whispered into his comm. His voice echoed slightly in the deserted alien hallway. The structure around them was strange. The walls were smooth and metallic, but they pulsed faintly, glowing with a dull blue light that shifted like a heartbeat. It wasn't like anything they'd seen before. Private Lee, the youngest on the team, scanned the area nervously. "Captain, I've got a bad feeling about this," Lee muttered. "We all do," replied Corporal Jenna, her tone steady but tense. "This place, it doesn't feel right." Rick didn't respond. He was focused. His years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts were screaming. Something about this mission was off. As they pushed deeper into the alien structure, they passed through rooms filled with strange, glowing symbols on the walls. Some of the symbols flickered, as if the building itself was alive and in pain. "Command said monsters," Sergeant Harris grumbled, his large frame taking up most of the hallway. "Where are they?" "All I see is a creepy, abandoned building." "Stay alert," Rick ordered. The squad moved further, their flashlights cutting through the dim, bluish haze. Then they reached a massive door at the end of the corridor. It was covered in glowing markings, and it hummed softly, as if it were breathing. "This must be it," Jenna said, her voice low. Rick nodded. "Harris, get it open." The sergeant approached the door, pulling out a small device. With a few beeps, the mechanism hissed, and the door slowly slid open. Cold air rushed out, and with it, a faint sound, a whisper. The team froze. "Did you hear that?" Lee whispered, his voice trembling. Rick raised his hand to silence him. They stepped inside, weapons raised, ready for an ambush. The room was enormous, dimly lit by strange, glowing crystals hanging from the ceiling. In the center, there were rows of large, cylindrical pods, each glowing faintly. The air was heavy, almost electric, and the faint sound of whispers grew louder. "What is this?" Jenna murmured, stepping closer to one of the pods. The team spread out, inspecting the strange devices. Each pod was filled with a pale, bluish liquid, and something floated inside. Rick's heart began to race as he stepped closer to one. He wiped the condensation off the glass with his glove. Inside the pod was a girl. Her skin was pale, with a faint otherworldly glow. Her hair floated gently in the liquid, shimmering as if it were made of stardust. Her eyes were closed, but her face looked peaceful, almost fragile. This isn't a monster," Rick said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenna gasped. "There's more. They're all girls. What the hell is going on here?" Rick turned to see the rest of the squad staring at the other pods. Each one contained a similar figure, young alien girls, trapped, floating in silence. Before anyone could say more, a sudden sound broke the silence. A soft, desperate voice. "Help, please. Help us." Rick spun around, his weapon raised. The voice wasn't coming from any of his teammates. It was coming from the pods. One of the girls had opened her eyes. Her glowing, silver eyes locked onto Rick's, and her lips moved weakly. "Help us. They hurt us." Rick stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't what they were told. They were sent here to kill monsters. Not this. "What the hell is going on?" Harris demanded, his voice rising in panic. The girl's voice grew stronger, though it was still soft. and filled with pain. They lied. "We're not monsters. We're prisoners. Please, help us." "Captain, what do we do?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. Rick didn't answer. His mind was spinning. If what the girl said was true, then their mission was a lie. But why? And who was behind this? Suddenly, alarms blared, filling the room with a deafening sound. Red lights flashed, and the walls seemed to tremble. "They know we're here," Harris shouted. Rick clenched his fists. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear: they couldn't just walk away. These weren't monsters, they were victims. "Everyone, get ready. We're not leaving them here," Rick ordered. As the team prepared for a fight, Rick glanced back at the alien girl in the pod. Her silver eyes were filled with hope. "We're going to get you out of here," he promised. The girl gave a weak, grateful smile as chaos erupted around them. The alien girl's plea. The silence in the room was deafening despite the distant wail of alarms. Rick's breath caught in his throat as the glowing silver eyes of the alien girl locked onto his. She wasn't afraid. She was pleading. The weight of her gaze felt heavier than the rifle in his hands. "Captain," Jenna whispered, her voice shaking. "What are they? What do we do?" Rick didn't answer immediately. His mind was spinning. The mission briefing played over in his head. Monsters. That's what Command had called them. Ruthless, deadly creatures that threatened humanity's survival. But there was no rage in the girl's expression, no bloodlust in her silver eyes. Instead, there was something far worse. Desperation. "Please." The girl's voice was soft, like a fragile thread barely holding itself together. "They will come. They will hurt us again. Don't let them." Her words were cut short by the crackle of static in Rick's comm. A harsh voice barked into his ear. "Status report, Daniels. Have you engaged the targets?" Rick didn't respond. His finger hovered over the comm button as he stared at the pod. The girl raised a trembling hand, pressing it weakly against the glass. She looked so human. Not entirely, but close enough to make his stomach churn. "Captain," Harris barked, breaking the moment. "We've got movement outside the hallway. Mechanized. Drones. Hold your position." Rick snapped, his voice harder than he felt. His thoughts were a storm, but he couldn't let it show. Not now. Not in front of the squad. The girl in the pod tried to speak again. Her voice came through faintly, as if the pod was suppressing it. "They lied to you." "We're not." She winced, her voice fading before she could finish. Jenna leaned closer to another pod. "Captain, these aren't monsters," she said, her voice barely audible. "Look at them. They're prisoners." "Prisoners or not," Harris interrupted, "they're not our mission. We need to move before those drones tear us apart." Rick's jaw tightened. His instincts were screaming at him. This wasn't right. The air in the room felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Before Rick could speak, the girl in the pod suddenly lifted her head. Her silver eyes flared, glowing brighter as she forced out a few more words. "Please, they experiment. Hurt us, use us. Don't leave us here." The words hit Rick like a punch to the gut. Experiment. Use. The mission brief had said nothing about this. His fists clenched as a deep sense of unease settled over him. Suddenly, Lee, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. "Captain, what if they're telling the truth?" His voice was shaky, his hands gripping his weapon tightly. "We can't just leave them here." Before Rick could answer, the room shook violently. The walls groaned as if alive, and the lights flickered. A metallic voice echoed through the structure. "Intruders detected. Lockdown initiated." Massive doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. Harris cursed under his breath, raising his rifle. "This is a trap, Daniels. We need to blow this place and get out." "Quiet," Rick barked. He turned back to the girl. Her glowing eyes dimmed, her strength fading. She was slipping away, and if he didn't act now, He'd lose whatever chance he had to understand the truth. Rick pressed his hand against the glass, meeting her gaze. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice firm but low. The girl hesitated, her glowing eyes darting to the hallway behind him. Her lips trembled as she whispered a single word. "Humans." Rick froze. The weight of that word crashed down on him like a tidal wave. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be true. Humanity was supposed to be the hero in this story, the savior of the galaxy. But if she was telling the truth? Before he could process it, Jenna's voice cut through his thoughts. "Captain, we've got incoming." The door they'd entered through exploded inward, sending shards of metal flying. A swarm of drones poured into the room, their mechanical limbs clicking as they moved. Their glowing red eyes scanned the area, locking onto the squad. "Open fire," Rick ordered. The room erupted into chaos. Bullets ricocheted off the drones' armored bodies as the squad fought to hold them back. But the drones weren't just targeting the soldiers, they were moving toward the pods. "They're trying to destroy the pods," Jenna shouted, taking down a drone with a well-placed shot. Rick's mind raced. If the drones succeeded, the alien girls would be killed. He didn't know why, but every instinct he had told him that couldn't happen. "Lee, cover me," Rick barked. He sprinted toward the nearest pod, slamming his hand against the control panel. The screen blinked red, displaying an error message. "Damn it," he cursed. The girl inside the pod weakly raised her hand again, her lips forming silent words. Rick leaned closer, desperate to understand. Her voice came through, faint but clear. "Override. Green panel. Save. Us." Rick's eyes darted to the glowing green panel on the wall across the room. It was surrounded by drones. "Harris. Jenna. Hold them off. I'm getting that panel," Rick shouted, bolting toward it. The fight intensified as the squad covered him, their weapons blazing. Rick reached the panel, his fingers flying over the unfamiliar controls. Alarms blared louder, the drones growing more aggressive. "Come on. Come on," Rick muttered, his heart pounding. Finally, the panel beeped, and the pods began to open one by one. The alien girls slumped out, collapsing onto the floor. The lead girl, the one with the silver eyes, looked up at Rick. Her voice was stronger now, but still filled with desperation. "They will come," she said. "More will come. But we can help you." Rick stared at her, his rifle still in hand. The room was a battlefield, the air thick with smoke and fear. And yet, in that moment, he knew one thing for certain. This mission had just become something far bigger than any of them. Betrayal from within. The dust was settling, but the tension in the air was suffocating. The alien girls lay weak and trembling on the floor, their glowing eyes watching the humans with a mix of fear and hope. Rick stood over them, his rifle still gripped tightly in his hands, scanning the room for the next threat. "Everyone okay?" he barked, his voice sharp. "We're clear for now," Jenna replied, reloading her weapon. Her hands were shaking, but her tone was steady. Lee crouched near one of the girls, offering her a small bottle of water. She stared at it suspiciously before cautiously reaching out to take it. "They're not dangerous," Lee said quietly, glancing up at Rick. "They're scared, Captain. Just like us." Rick nodded, though his mind was far from at ease. "Scared or not, we need to move. This place is crawling with." A soft click interrupted him. Rick turned sharply, his instincts screaming. Just as Harris stepped forward, his rifle aimed not at the drones, but at Rick himself. "What the hell are you doing, Harris?" Rick growled, his voice low and dangerous. Harris didn't lower his weapon. His eyes were cold, calculating. "Finishing the mission," he said simply. Jenna froze, her weapon halfway raised. "Harris, what are you talking about? The mission's changed. Look at them. They're not monsters. They're exactly what Command said they were," Harris snapped. "Tools. Weapons. And you're all too blind to see it." Rick took a step forward, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Stand down, Harris." "That's an order." Harris laughed bitterly. "You don't get it, do you, Captain? Command didn't send us here to kill monsters. They sent us to clean up their mess. These things," he gestured at the alien girls, "aren't innocent victims. They're experiments, and if we let them live, it's our heads on the chopping block." The room fell into a tense silence, the only sound the faint hum of the alien structure around them. "You knew," Rick said quietly, his voice like steel. "You knew what this mission really was." Harris didn't deny it. "I did what I had to do, and now I'm doing it again. These girls don't leave this planet. None of us do, unless we finish the job." The squad was frozen, torn between their loyalty to Rick and the fear in Harris's voice. "Drop the weapon," Rick ordered, his voice cold. Harris smirked. "Not a chance, Captain. You've gone soft. You're willing to risk humanity's safety for a bunch of alien experiments." "They're not experiments," Rick shot back. "They're people. And if you think I'm going to stand by while you murder them, you're dead wrong." The tension snapped like a taut wire. Harris lunged, his weapon firing a shot that missed Rick by inches. The room erupted into chaos as Rick tackled him, their weapons clattering to the ground. "Harris, stop!" Jenna shouted, but it was too late. The fight was brutal, raw. Harris was strong, but Rick had years of experience and a boiling rage driving him. The two men grappled, their fists connecting in a flurry of blows. Harris managed to get the upper hand, pinning Rick to the ground and pulling a knife from his belt. "You don't get it, Daniels," Harris snarled. "You're risking everything for nothing." Rick gritted his teeth, twisting his body and throwing Harris off balance. He grabbed a nearby piece of shattered metal and swung, knocking Harris unconscious with a heavy thud. The room fell silent again, save for the sound of Rick's heavy breathing. He stood, wiping blood from his face, and looked at the rest of the squad. "Anyone else have a problem with the mission?" he asked, his voice cold and sharp. No one moved. Jenna shook her head, her eyes wide. Lee swallowed hard but stayed silent. Rick turned to the alien girls, who were huddled together, watching the scene with a mix of fear and confusion. The one with silver eyes slowly stood, her legs shaky but determined. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice, though weak, carried a strength that made Rick pause. He glanced down at Harris's unconscious form, then back at his team. "We're not here to clean up anyone's mess," he said firmly. "We're here to do what's right. And right now, that means getting them out of here alive." The silver-eyed girl stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on Rick's arm. "They won't stop," she said. "They'll come for you too. For all of us. But we can help." Rick met her gaze, seeing the truth in her eyes. He didn't know how, but he believed her. "Then we'll fight together," he said. "But first, we need to get off this planet." As the team regrouped, Rick felt the weight of the mission shift once again. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, and he'd do whatever it took to see it through. But in the back of his mind, one thought lingered. If Harris was working for command, how far did the betrayal go? And who else was coming for them? The chase. The air outside the alien facility was heavier than it had been when they arrived. The distant horizon shimmered with an unnatural haze, as if the planet itself were waking up, angry at their intrusion. Rick didn't need to glance behind him to know the drones were coming. The faint hum of their engines was already creeping closer, growing louder by the second. "Move, everyone, move," Rick barked, pushing his team forward. The alien girls stumbled alongside them, their frail bodies struggling to keep up. The silver-eyed girl, who seemed to be the strongest, tried to help another, pulling her arm over her shoulder. We need to get to the hills," she said, her voice strained but determined. "They can't track us in the ridges." Rick glanced at her, his mind racing. "Lee, take point. Jenna, cover our six. We need to keep them alive." Alive. Harris spat, trudging alongside them, his hands tied behind his back after his earlier betrayal. You're leading us straight to our graves, Captain. You think you can outrun them? You're dreaming. Rick ignored him. Harris's words were poison now, and he couldn't afford to let them seep in. His focus was on the mission, the new mission. Get these girls off the planet, expose the truth, and make sure his team survived in the process. Behind them, the hum of the drones grew louder, sharper. Jenna fired a warning shot, the sound of the rifle echoing across the barren landscape. They're gaining, she shouted. Rick cursed under his breath. The terrain was uneven, jagged rocks jutting out from the ground like the broken teeth of some long-dead beast. The alien facility loomed behind them, its strange, pulsating glow casting eerie shadows across the wasteland. Captain, the silver-eyed girl said, her voice cutting through the chaos. The drones, they're not just tracking us. They're calling reinforcements. Rick's stomach sank. What do you mean, reinforcements? She hesitated, her glowing eyes darting to the sky. They're waking the others. Before Rick could ask what she meant, the ground beneath them rumbled. A low, guttural sound echoed from somewhere far off, like the growl of a giant waking from its slumber. What the hell was that? Lee asked, his voice trembling. The silver-eyed girl's expression darkened. The machines, they aren't the only ones guarding this place. The drones will bring the beasts. They're programmed to stop anyone who tries to leave. Rick tightened his grip on his rifle. Great. More surprises. Keep moving. The team scrambled over a ridge, the jagged rocks cutting into their boots. The alien girls struggled, their frail bodies not built for this kind of exertion. Rick found himself moving to help the silver-eyed girl, who was now practically carrying one of the others. Captain, Jenna called from behind. Rick turned just in time to see the first wave of drones cresting the ridge they'd just crossed. Their red lights flickered like demonic eyes, their sleek metallic bodies glinting in the faint light of the alien sky. Down, Rick shouted. The squad dropped, pulling the alien girls down with them as the drones opened fire. Bullets and plasma rounds tore through the air, sending shards of rock flying in every direction. We can't outrun them, Jenna yelled, returning fire. Rick's mind raced. The silver-eyed girl's words echoed in his head. They can't track us in the ridges. This way, he shouted, motioning to a narrow crevice that split the rocky terrain. The team scrambled into the crevice, the walls closing in around them. The sound of the drone's engines became muffled, though the occasional burst of gunfire reminded them the chase was far from over. As they pressed deeper into the ridges, the ground trembled again. This time, the growling sound was closer, louder. What's making that noise? Lee asked, his voice shaking. The silver-eyed girl glanced at him, her expression grim. The beasts. They're part of this place, part of the experiments. The machines control them, but they're wild. If they find us. She didn't finish, but the fear in her voice said enough. Rick stopped at a fork in the crevice, scanning the paths ahead. Which way? The silver-eyed girl hesitated, her glowing eyes flickering as if she were searching for something invisible. Finally, she pointed to the left. That way. It leads to the ruins. We'll be safer there. Rick didn't question her. Jenna, take Harris. Lee, help the girls. I'll cover the rear. The team moved quickly, their steps echoing in the narrow space. Behind them, the growling grew louder, accompanied by the distant whir of drone engines. Rick glanced over his shoulder, his gut twisting. Shadows danced along the walls, massive and inhuman. Whatever was chasing them wasn't far behind. They emerged from the crevice into a clearing surrounded by strange, ancient ruins. The structures were massive, towering over them like skeletons of a forgotten civilization. What is this place? Jenna asked, her voice hushed. The silver-eyed girl looked around, her expression unreadable. Home, she said softly. Before anyone could respond, A deafening roar shattered the air. The ground trembled violently as a massive creature emerged from the shadows. It was unlike anything Rick had ever seen. Part machine, part beast, its glowing red eyes locking onto them with terrifying precision. "Open fire," Rick shouted. The team unleashed a barrage of bullets and plasma, but the creature barely flinched. It roared again, its metallic claws tearing through the ruins as it charged. Rick's heart pounded. This wasn't just a chase anymore. This was survival. "Get to cover," he yelled, his voice drowned out by the creature's roar. As the battle raged, Rick realized one thing. This planet wasn't just a prison for the alien girls. It was a death trap for anyone who dared to leave. The villain's truth. The ruins were eerily silent after the chaos of the battle. The creature lay motionless now, its massive body half submerged in the rubble, sparks flying from the exposed machinery in its chest. The team was scattered among the ruins, catching their breath and tending to their wounds. Rick stood over the creature, staring at the fusion of flesh and metal. It was an abomination, a twisted hybrid of nature and engineering. He felt a sickening weight in his chest as he realized what this meant. "This isn't just a monster," Jenna said, limping over to him. "It's a machine, built to hunt." "Built by who?" Rick muttered, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The silver-eyed girl stepped forward, her face pale and her breathing shallow. "By them," she said quietly. "The ones who took us. The ones who did this to us." Rick turned to her, his jaw tightening. "You need to tell me everything. Who are they? Why are you here? And why the hell are they trying so hard to kill you?" The girl hesitated, glancing at the other alien girls who were huddled together. She seemed to weigh her words carefully before speaking. "They call themselves humans," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But they are not like you." Rick stiffened, his heart sinking. She continued, "They came to our world many cycles ago. They said they were explorers, searching for knowledge. But they lied. They took our people, our children, and brought them here. They called it research." Her silver eyes glimmered with anger. "They wanted to use us, to turn us into weapons for their wars." Rick felt a chill run down his spine. The girl's words confirmed what he feared ever since they'd found the pods. "This mission," Rick said slowly, "it wasn't about eliminating a threat, was it?" The girl shook her head. "No, it was about covering their tracks. We were failures in their eyes. Too dangerous, too unpredictable. So they left us here, guarded by their machines. And now they've sent you to finish the job." The weight of her words hit Rick like a freight train. He clenched his fists, his thoughts a storm of anger and betrayal. "They sent us to kill you," he said bitterly, "because they didn't want the truth getting out." The girl nodded. If the galaxy knew what they had done, it would destroy them. Their power, their control, it would crumble. Before Rick could respond, Lee called out from the other side of the ruins. "Captain, you need to see this." Rick and the others hurried over to where Lee was crouched by a shattered console buried in the rubble. The screen was cracked, but it was still active, flickering with streams of data. "What is it?" Rick asked. Lee tapped a few buttons, and a holographic image flickered to life. It showed a room filled with humans in lab coats, standing around a massive containment chamber. Inside the chamber was a young alien girl, her body suspended in a glowing liquid. "This is live," Lee said, his voice shaking. "This isn't from the past. This is happening right now." The silver-eyed girl gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That's my sister." Rick stared at the screen, his fists clenching. The image shifted, showing a man standing at the center of the lab. He was tall, with sharp features and a cold, calculating expression. His voice came through the console, smooth and confident. "Phase 3 is nearly complete," the man said. "Once we have refined the process, we'll have a weapon capable of ensuring humanity's dominance for the next century." Rick's stomach churned. This was the man behind it all, the one who had ordered the experiments, the abductions, and now the cover-up. The man turned to the camera, his icy gaze piercing through the screen. If anyone tries to stop us, they will be eliminated. The mission is too important to risk. The feed cut off, leaving the screen flickering with static. Rick stood in silence, his mind racing. This wasn't just about the alien girls anymore. This was about exposing a crime so monstrous it could shake the foundations of the galaxy. "We need to stop this," Rick said, his voice firm. "We need to expose him." Jenna looked at him, her expression uncertain. "How, Captain? We don't even know where that lab is." The silver-eyed girl stepped forward, her face set with determination. "I know," she said. "I've seen it before. It's where they took us when they first brought us here." Rick nodded. "Then we're going there. We're not running anymore. We're taking the fight to them." Harris, still bound and sitting nearby, let out a bitter laugh. "You're insane, Daniels. You think you can take on command. They'll kill you before you even get close." Rick walked over to Harris, staring him down. "Maybe, but I'd rather die fighting for the truth than live as a pawn in their lies." As the team prepared to move, the silver-eyed girl placed a hand on Rick's arm. "You're risking everything for us," she said softly. "Why?" Rick met her gaze, his eyes filled with resolve. "Because someone has to, and because I'm done following orders that make me the villain." The girl nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. For the first time, there was hope in her eyes. But as the team began their journey toward the lab, Rick couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, one they might not escape. Sacrifice and revelation. The landscape stretched out like a graveyard of forgotten civilizations. Crumbling towers and shattered arches loomed over the team as they moved through the ruins toward the distant lab. The sky above was a sickly green, flickering with lightning that cast jagged shadows across the ground. Every sound, every footstep, every breath echoed like a warning. Rick led the group, his rifle ready, but his thoughts were far from the trigger. Each step brought them closer to the lab, closer to the enemy, and closer to what he suspected would be their final stand. Behind him, the silver-eyed girl walked silently, her head held high despite the exhaustion etched across her features. She had taken the lead among the alien girls, helping the weaker ones and offering quiet reassurances. Rick couldn't help but admire her strength. "Captain," Jenna said, breaking the silence. She jogged up beside him, her voice low. "We're being followed." Rick glanced back. Lee was trailing behind, his head constantly on a swivel, his weapon raised. Even Harris, still bound, looked uneasy. "Drones?" Rick asked. Jenna shook her head. "No, something bigger. I've seen movement in the shadows. It's staying just out of sight." Rick's stomach tightened. He stopped, raising his fist to signal the team to halt. The silver-eyed girl came up beside him, her glowing eyes scanning the ruins. "They've sent the beasts," she said softly. Rick clenched his jaw. "How many?" She closed her eyes, her head tilting slightly as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. When she opened them, her expression was grim. "3. They're closing in fast." Rick turned to his squad. "We can't outrun them. We'll have to stand and fight." "Fight?" Harris spat, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're out of your mind, Daniels. Those things will tear us apart." Rick ignored him. "Jenna, Lee, take up defensive positions. Protect the girls. I'll draw them out." The silver-eyed girl grabbed his arm. "No," she said firmly. "You don't understand. These beasts were designed to hunt and kill anything that tries to leave this planet. You can't fight them like this." Rick stared at her, his mind racing. "Then how do we stop them?" She hesitated, glancing at the other girls. Their expressions were somber, resigned. "We can stop them," she said, her voice trembling. "But it will cost us." "What do you mean?" Rick asked, his tone sharp. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "They're connected to us. The machines, the beasts, they're all part of the same network. If we use our power, we can disrupt it, shut it down. But she faltered, her gaze dropping to the ground. But what? Rick pressed. Her silver eyes met his, filled with a deep, quiet sorrow. It will drain us. If we use too much, we won't survive. The words hit Rick like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to argue, to find another solution, but the ground beneath them shook violently, cutting him off. A roar tore through the air, deafening and primal. The first beast appeared, its massive, twisted form emerging from the shadows. It was worse than the last, a grotesque fusion of metal and flesh, its glowing red eyes locked onto them. "Here they come," Lee shouted, opening fire. The team sprang into action, bullets and plasma bolts lighting up the ruins. But the beast was relentless, shrugging off the attacks as if they were nothing. Rick turned to the silver-eyed girl. "If you can do it, now's the time." She nodded, her expression resolute. She stepped forward, the other alien girls gathering around her. They joined hands, forming a circle, and their bodies began to glow with an ethereal light. The air around them crackled with energy, and the beast hesitated, its movements faltering. For a moment, Rick thought they might actually win. Then the second beast appeared. It charged from the side, its massive claws tearing through a crumbling tower. The ground shook violently as it roared, joining its sibling in the hunt. The girls' light faltered, their energy wavering. The silver-eyed girl looked back at Rick, her face pale and strained. "We need more time." Rick nodded. "Jenna, Lee, focus fire on the second one. I'll handle the first." Jenna shot him a look. "Handle it? Are you insane?" Rick didn't answer. He grabbed a grenade from his belt, pulling the pin as he sprinted toward the first beast. "Daniels," Harris shouted, his voice a mix of shock and disbelief. Rick ignored him, ducking under a swipe of the beast's claws and hurling the grenade at its exposed mechanical core. The explosion rocked the air, sending the creature stumbling backward, but it wasn't enough to bring it down. The silver-eyed girl screamed, the sound raw and powerful. The light around her and the other girls flared, blindingly bright. The beasts froze, their red eyes flickering as if something inside them was breaking. Rick shielded his eyes, feeling the heat of the energy wash over him. When he looked again, the beasts were convulsing, their mechanical parts sparking wildly. With one final deafening roar, they collapsed, their bodies crumpling into lifeless heaps. The light faded, and Rick turned to the girls. They were on the ground, their bodies limp and unmoving. The silver-eyed girl's breathing was shallow, her skin pale. Rick rushed to her side, dropping to his knees. "Stay with me," he said, his voice rough. "We're almost there." She opened her eyes, a faint smile on her lips. "We've done what we can," she whispered. "The rest is up to you." Rick's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but there was no time. The lab was still ahead, and the truth was still hidden. He stood, his gaze hard as steel. "We'll finish this," he said, his voice filled with determination. Behind him, the ruins were quiet once more, but the battle was far from over. Freedom and justice. The lab loomed ahead, an imposing monolith of steel and light. It pulsed with an eerie hum, its towering spires crackling with energy. The structure seemed alive, as if it were watching their every move. Rick stood at the edge of the ruins, staring at the massive complex. His squad was battered, their faces pale and lined with exhaustion, but their eyes burned with the same fire that gripped his chest. Behind them, the alien girls lay resting in the shadows of the ruins, their bodies frail and still. The silver-eyed girl had insisted they leave her, and the others behind to recover. "You're the only ones who can finish this," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. "The truth is inside. Set it free." Her words echoed in Rick's mind as he tightened his grip on his rifle. He turned to his team. "This is it. We go in, we expose the truth, And we get out. No second chances. Jenna nodded, her rifle slung over her shoulder. If we don't make it, at least the galaxy will know what happened here. Speak for yourselves, Harris muttered, his hand still bound. This is suicide. Rick shot him a glare. You don't get a vote, Harris. Let's move. The squad approached the lab cautiously, the air around it crackling with energy. The massive doors hissed open as they neared, as if inviting them inside. That's not creepy at all, Lee muttered under his breath. Rick led the way, his rifle raised. The interior of the lab was pristine, almost sterile. Bright white lights reflected off the polished metal walls, and the faint hum of machinery echoed through the empty halls. This place looks untouched, Jenna said, her voice low. Because it is, Rick replied. They never expected anyone to make it this far. They moved deeper into the lab, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Rick's heart pounded in his chest. Every shadow, every flicker of light felt like a trap waiting to spring. Then they reached it, a massive central chamber filled with rows of containment pods, similar to the ones they'd seen in the facility before. But these pods were active, their occupants suspended in glowing liquid. Rick approached one, his stomach twisting. Inside was a young alien girl, her face serene but her body scarred with surgical marks. They're still experimenting, Jenna said, her voice trembling with rage. Before Rick could respond, a voice echoed through the chamber, smooth and cold. I must say, Captain Daniels, I'm impressed you made it this far. The squad spun around, their weapons raised. Standing on a platform above them was the man from the hologram, the mastermind behind the experiments. He looked calm, almost amused, as he stared down at them. Who the hell are you? Rick demanded. The man smiled faintly. I am Dr. Corvin. You could say I'm the architect of this little project. Rick's blood boiled. You're the monster behind this. Corvin chuckled. Monster? No, Captain. I'm a visionary. These creatures are the key to humanity's survival. Their abilities, their power, it's unparalleled. With them, we can secure humanity's place in the galaxy. At what cost? Jenna shouted, her voice shaking. You've butchered them, tortured them. They're living beings, not tools. Corvin's expression darkened. Living beings, he repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. They are resources, nothing more. And you, he gestured at the squad, you are trespassers. The room trembled as security drones descended from the ceiling, their weapons trained on the team. Drop your weapons, Corvin ordered. Surrender, and perhaps I'll let you live long enough to see the greatness your sacrifice will achieve. Rick glanced at his squad. Jenna's hands were steady on her rifle. Lee's face was pale, but his eyes were locked on Corvin. Even Harris, despite his earlier cowardice, seemed ready to fight. Rick smirked. Not a chance. Before Corvin could respond, Rick opened fire. The chamber erupted into chaos as the team engaged the drones, bullets, and plasma bolts ripping through the air. Corvin retreated, disappearing into a side corridor. Lee, Jenna, cover me. Rick shouted, breaking off to follow Corvin. The corridor twisted and turned, but Rick didn't stop. He burst into a control room, finding Corvin at a massive console. You don't understand what you're doing, Corvin said, his voice calm despite the chaos. If you destroy this, you destroy humanity's future. Rick raised his rifle. Humanity doesn't need a future built on this. Corvin's hand moved toward a button, but Rick fired, the shot grazing his arm. Corvin cried out, stumbling back. Rick approached the console, his eyes scanning the controls. One button stood out, a glowing red switch labeled Purge Protocol. Do it, a voice whispered. Rick turned to see the silver-eyed girl standing in the doorway, her body glowing faintly. She looked weaker than ever, but her expression was resolute. How did you? Rick started, but she cut him off. There's no time. This place, these experiments, the machines, they're all connected. Destroying the lab will free the others. End this nightmare. Rick hesitated. What about you? She smiled faintly. It doesn't matter. What matters is the truth. Rick's hand hovered over the button. Corgan groaned from the floor, his voice weak. You'll regret this. You'll doom us all. Rick slammed his hand down on the switch. The lab shook violently as alarms blared. The containment pods shattered, their occupants disappearing in flashes of light. The machines collapsed, their lights flickering out. The silver-eyed girl smiled one last time before her body dissolved into glowing particles, her energy spreading through the room. Rick stumbled out of the lab as it crumbled behind him, his team waiting for him in the ruins. It's done, he said, his voice heavy. Jenna placed a hand on his shoulder. You did the right thing, Captain. Rick looked up at the sky, now clear and quiet. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air felt lighter. The galaxy would know the truth.